Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for joining us for our first distinguished lecture series, or distinguished lecture for our spring lecture series. Like all things, an event like this isn't possible without people behind it. I would like to thank Miranda Redmond and Mateo Garbaletto, who's probably not here, and of course Kelly for putting all of the logistics together. Thank you kindly. Tim Bowles is an assistant professor of agroecology. His work looks at the ways in which biodiversity and ecological processes can produce more resilient and healthy agricultural systems. Tim, I really appreciate Tim, particularly in the work that he's doing toward diversity, equity, and inclusion. His work with historically Black and universities and colleges, and bringing students there to here to Cal, and bridging that academic divide has been formidable and inspirational. So, please join me in welcoming Tim, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. I know we're all super busy at the beginning of the semester, but it's really good to see a lot of familiar faces. It's like we so rarely get an opportunity to learn about each other's research, I feel like, in this department, being so big. And it's really quite an honor and really humbling to be selected for this lecture, especially knowing who some of the past people have been. So thank you. It was pretty hard to decide what to talk with you about today. And so rather than give you kind of like the overview of all of the work that the lab is doing, I wanted to stick with really one theme and share how it has evolved over time since I began thinking about climate risk in agriculture about 7 or 8 years ago. The set of projects that I'll talk about does have some similarities with other work in my lab. For instance, quantifying the benefits of more diversified farming systems. I'm trying to align policies to actually reflect those benefits. But the work that I'll talk about today also has a lot of major differences. Much of our work in California, and most of this work will be not in California, but our work here is really place-based and involves interdisciplinary on-farm research, looking at plant-soil interactions, which is really at the heart of what a lot of the folks in our lab do. But this set of projects has kind of taken me in unexpected directions as I keep kind of following the thread of climate risk and diversified agricultural systems. And so I wanted to talk about this in part. We just got some new funding to expand the work that we're doing. And so I thought it was kind of appropriate to share a bit about where we're at with it. And so just acknowledging upfront that this really does take a village, all of these different projects, many collaborators, students, and others, and I'll highlight some key individuals as we move along. So let me just start with what I think of as one of the most striking images of agriculture in the US. Here, the yellow pixels are corn, and green pixels are soybeans. And so if you look in the continental US, almost 10% of land area is planted in just one of these two species. It shouldn't come as a surprise that these systems produce quite a number of calories, mainly for livestock feed, and also for biofuels. And it's, of course, really well recognized that they have a lot of externalities as well. They are dependent on non-renewable inputs of fertilizers and pesticides that lead to eutrophication of water, things like the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, soil erosion, greenhouse gas emissions, while also driving landscape simplification, biodiversity loss on the kind of environmental side of things, but also leading to consolidation of farms and very low profit margins for many farmers. So these systems have a lot of issues, including being quite vulnerable to extreme weather events like droughts and floods. So this is a picture of Darren Becker's 5th generation family farm during the 2012 drought that hit about 2/3 of the country. This was the worst drought since the Dust Bowl. It caused about $100 billion in damage. And you can see up in this graph, these are yield trend lines for corn, and the big dip right there is 2012. And so we see yields dropping 25% below the trend line. And so this was a pretty extreme event, but less extreme or even less widespread weather events can still cause major issues, both for individual farmers and for supply chains. We certainly see what happens over the last year with the war in Ukraine about when food supplies get disrupted, how it can propagate throughout the whole world. And with climate risks increasing all across the world, we are expecting to see more synchrony of these types of climate shocks across the world that can disrupt food supplies. But in spite of the magnitude of this extreme weather event, federally subsidized crop insurance payments really prevented a lot of economic devastation for farmers. So this is showing crop insurance payouts by county. For corn, this was nearly $10 billion just for corn alone in 2012. And so we can think of crop insurance, or maybe even a better term, something like farm insurance, as being a pretty good idea. It's a necessary part of any farm safety net, right? Farming is risky, and farmers shouldn't go out of business because of one bad year. But depending on how these types of safety nets are set up, they can either they can help prevent economic devastation, but they can also actually increase aggregate risk. And that's what we see with the crop insurance system that we have. Who is excited about the Farm Bill this year? All right, awesome. Yeah, we have a Farm Bill year every 5 years, right? And this is a huge piece of legislation. Lord knows whether it'll actually anything pass with the House that we have. But crop insurance is actually the second biggest title in the Farm Bill. The nutrition title is by far the biggest chunk of the Farm Bill, but if we look at the second biggest, it's crop insurance. And this is insuring over 100 different commodity crops, either against yield or revenue losses due to quote unquote natural causes. I put this in quotes because with between 1/4 and 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions coming from agri-food systems, what constitutes natural anymore, I think, is debatable. But actually, taxpayers are bearing the brunt of the cost of this crop insurance program. This is a highly subsidized crop insurance program. Farmers are paying only about 40% of the true premium cost. So what this does, because of the way that it's set up, is it really externalizes the risk of these types of highly subsidized, highly simplified systems, right? Farmers don't have a whole lot of intrinsic motivation to mitigate their own risk when they have this safety net in place. We also know that the costs of crop insurance under this current system will go up with climate change. And we've already seen those increases happening, especially as weather will become more severe, including in the Midwest, where a lot of my work is on this focused. So we have higher potential for floods by the end of the century, with large increases in the heaviest 1% of precipitation events. And we also have more potential for droughts. This is showing projected increases in vapor pressure deficit in kind of this area of the so-called Corn Belt. Vapor pressure deficit is the difference between the amount of moisture in the air and how much moisture the air can hold when it's saturated. It's kind of a good measure of crop potential for crop stress for water. But one thing that's come up a lot in these circles is the potential role for soil organic matter to play in mitigating risk from severe weather. This is a really nice study that looks at soil organic matter data at the county level and crop yields at the county level across different severities of drought, from normal conditions all the way up to very severe conditions. And we see that the relationship between levels of soil organic matter along the x-axis and yields along the y-axis becomes increasingly strong as drought severity increases. And in fact, they've had a nice kind of narrative description of this, with an increase in 1% organic matter was associated with a 36% reduction in the mean proportion of liabilities paid. That's crop insurance liabilities paid. So not only is this protecting against yields, but it's also then translating into less crop insurance indemnities as soil organic matter increases. But we need to look at the details here, because if we look at these different colors of dots, these actually correspond to different soil orders. So this is not a reflection of management history, known as gradient of soil organic matter. This is a reflection of inherent soil characteristics. So I think this is a real issue, considering that inherent soil quality and these inherent soil characteristics strongly correlate with land values. And we know that access to valuable land is definitely not equitable. So there's an agricultural economist, Josh Woodard, who in a paper argues for including soil data in calculation of crop insurance premiums, arguing that, well, if a farmer has higher levels of soil organic matter and then it costs less to insure them, well, they should see a lower premium because of that. But if this is really because of not related to what they're actually doing, but because of the land that they're on, I think we have a kind of an ethical and equity dilemma there if we're thinking about using soil organic matter data in that way. So now getting kind of to the potential role of diversifying cropping systems. So by diversifying cropping systems, I mean adding additional cash crops into a rotation, including things like cover crops that often go hand in hand with those types of changes. And we've seen a lot of research documenting how diversifying cropping systems can address a number of different environmental issues related to industrialized agriculture. This is just one study from a long-term experiment from Matt Liebman's group in Iowa. And we can see that with these 3- and 4-year rotations in the dotted and gray lines here, substantial decreases in non-renewable inputs, decreases in potential for freshwater toxicity issues, decreases in energy use, right? These are common findings from studies looking at diversified cropping systems. But what we don't know nearly as much about is to what extent diversified cropping systems can also reduce risks from extreme weather. So these systems may reduce risks from a few different ways. The first of which is pretty straightforward, and I'll cover kind of quickly. First is thinking about spatial variation. So, right, crop rotation is the sequence of crops grown through time. But if we think about a collection of fields in space that all have different rotations, that means that more diversified rotations aren't just increasing diversity in time, they're also increasing diversity in space. Right? And so this means that with an increase in spatial variation, we have more response diversity, more different crops being grown at the same time, and that may have different responses to extreme weather. And there's been good work to show that this mechanism, this portfolio effect of different crops, can increase resilience at scales kind of greater than the farm or at regional scales. But there are also other aspects of crop diversity that could contribute to reducing risk. So kind of going back to the role of soil organic matter, a lot of work has also been done about how diversified cropping systems can improve soil. This has been known for a long time. I love this picture right here from the early 40s, showing a corn monoculture and corn in rotation. After a heavy rain. This is a very just striking image after a heavy rainfall where we see a lot of ponding, lack of infiltration on the top, much better conditions on the bottom. Meta-analyses have shown that relative to a monoculture, diversified rotations can increase soil carbon and things like microbial biomass, which are also important for other soil functions. So we think a lot of work has established this relationship between diversified cropping systems and these parameters of soil health, but then to what extent those changes in soil then feed back to potentially improve productivity is much less known. And so this is really getting now honing in at some of the questions that we have today. Resilience has a number of different components. This is based on work from Amelie Gaden's group. And one of those components is to what extent crop can resist or respond less severely to a stressful weather event. So you can kind of see this in this graph here, where we have different responses to something like a drought. So that's what the signal that I wanted to look for. And we saw an opportunity in looking at long-term agricultural experiments. Ecologists do a lot of cross-site synthesis in their work from long-term ecological research experiments. Neon is an example, of course. Mariflux is a great example. But in agriculture, there hasn't been nearly as much work done pulling together historical data and doing a lot of cross-site synthesis from long-term experiments. And so this is a project that I began back in 2016, collaborating with folks from 11 different long-term experiments on crop rotational diversity across the US and Canada, spanning a pretty wide precipitation gradient from pretty wet conditions in Maryland to pretty dry conditions all the way in Colorado. So some of you may have seen me talk about this work before. This is really just the starting point for today. So from each of these long-term experiments, we collected corn yield data in each of the rotation. We have about 11,000 observations and 350 site years, so a pretty deep data set, and established a few different hypotheses about the relationship between a history of crop rotational diversity and yields and stress. So just kind of explaining these here. So if we have crop yields on the y-axis, stress on the x-axis, we could imagine, of course, in any type of rotation, yields going down as stress increases. But do we see a differential response if a crop has been grown in a more diverse rotation? We might see trade-offs where at low levels of stress, there's similar levels of yield, but then as stress increases, we see crop grown in a more diverse rotation actually performing better. Or we might see a different type of trade-off where more diverse rotations might be better at low levels of stress. And then as things get so stressful, it just converges. So we measured stress in these experiments in kind of a roundabout way. Rather than looking at actual weather data, we looked at the mean yield of all of the different systems that were grown in the same year at a given site. And this is called an environmental index, and it comes from a lot of breeding studies use this type of approach to kind of characterize the growing conditions in a given year. And then we looked at, we took a measure of crop rotation to kind of boil it down to a single number, which we called the rotational complexity index, which is a function of both the number of different species in rotation and also the length of the rotation. So there's a lot of results here that I won't go into all the way, but on the left here, we have site level estimates from Bayesian multi-level models looking at just the effect of crop rotation on yields. So anything to the right of the dotted line means that rotation's having a positive effect on yields. But then it becomes more interesting when we look at an interaction between rotational complexity and our measure of stress, the environmental index. Where anything to the right of the line means that the rotation effect is magnified or increases as stress decreases, which would kind of correspond to the dotted line hypothesis right there. And we see not as clear results here, but some clear interactions. For instance, as growing conditions improve in our metric of stress by 1,000 kilograms per hectare, in maize grown in the most diverse rotation at our site in Nebraska has a predicted yield almost 400 kilograms per hectare greater than that of the maize monoculture. So we can also look at this in kind of a different way, looking at sort of the tails of the probability distributions of either simple or complex rotations, where we look at the probability of yield failure and the probability of very high yields in simple versus complex rotations. That's in purple or green here. So if these bars are shifted to the right, in the complex rotations, that means there's both less of a chance of yield failure and a greater chance of higher yields. And that is what we see in almost all of these different long-term experiments, with the exceptions of the site in Colorado, which is in the driest conditions. And so kind of circling back around to some of the hypotheses, we didn't actually see these types of trade-offs. What we saw was that by and large, these more diverse rotations had higher yields at kind of most across the board of stress. But we didn't really, using this source of measure of stress called the environmental index, we didn't really know what the source of stress was. Was it a drought? Was it a flood? So then we use publicly available data on crop insurance indemnity payments. And we see that in the sites in the US where these data are available, drought was the biggest source of indemnity payments over the time period where these long-term experiments were done. And so then we could hone in on particular years where based on crop insurance payouts, we could identify it as being a very stressful drought year, and then compare yields in simplified monoculture maize versus maize grown in a more complex rotation. And in 6 of the 9 US sites, we see significantly greater yields during these drought years. So honing in a little bit on one of these sites, the site in Michigan, we did kind of an experiment to triangulate some of these results that we were seeing from the long-term experiment, where I took soil that was grown, soil that was from these different, had a history of these different rotations, and did kind of a common garden experiment in the greenhouse with under control water conditions and drought water conditions, and measured all sorts of plant parameters, including leaf gas exchange. And so just as one example here, you see that with photosynthesis and stomotoconductance, corn that was grown in a soil that had a history of diverse rotations had much less of a response to drought conditions than corn that was grown in soil with a history of more simplified rotations. So these plants were performing better, were able to maintain their physiological processes when grown in this soil that had a history of more complex rotations. So in this first set of, in this first synthesis, what did we learn and what didn't we learn? First, we learned that crop rotation reduces risks of very low yields in corn, but also increases chances of higher yields during good conditions. The extremes of the precipitation gradient, very dry and very wet conditions, didn't show this as much. But we didn't relate it as much to actual weather. We're still only looking at one crop, corn, as an indicator, and we still don't know much about the mechanisms. So I want to talk about 3 kind of ongoing studies that begin to get at these questions. First is another set of long-term experimental syntheses that's being led by PhD student, Alessio Costa. And in this, we've combined long-term experiments on corn, but also on winter and spring small grains like oats and wheat into a data set that's about 2.5 times the size, where Alessio has also pulled in actual weather data. So this is some work that's just about to be submitted. And there's a lot going on in here. So if we have 3 different crops, we have spring and winter small grains and then maize. We have what are called yield anomalies on the y-axis. This is basically just a way of making the yields sort of specific to a particular site and particular weather conditions. So 0 is set for yields of monoculture in average weather. And then along the x-axis, we have our measure of diversity, which is a Simpson's diversity metric. So what we really should just be paying attention to here as sort of our broad takeaways is the shape of these curves. In the corn data, we see similar results that I did, that but now we see it across different types of weather conditions, that as diversity of the rotation increases, we see higher yields, and this includes in, say, dry and warm conditions, like this would be this red dotted line here, as well as cold and wetter conditions. But interestingly enough, we see a different relationship with the small grains, where we actually see a saturating relationship of diversity. And then what appears to be yields of actually going down at higher levels of diversity. And so there's a lot of questions about what could be driving that dip as diversity increases, potential functional redundancy at higher levels of diversity or potential resource depletion or disease problems. So I think there's a lot of interesting questions to look at from why that's occurring. We also need, and when we think about a crop rotation, and one real limitation of our work has been only looking at one of the crops that's being grown, right? So I can say that crop yields are higher in corn that's being grown in a diverse rotation, but that by definition means that corn is being grown less often. So total production of that one crop goes down. So we really have to start looking at the entire rotation. And this is what we're doing with a new, well, this is new, not new anymore, it's a couple of years old, a collaborative project we're calling Drives. But this is actually really tricky and involves thinking carefully about the metrics that we're using to evaluate our agricultural systems. Because if we're going to look across all of these different crops, we have to put them on some sort of a common metric. It could be the energy that's produced. It could be the nutrients that are produced, or we could look at it from a farmer's perspective in terms of gross or net returns. And each one of these metrics is likely to tell a different story. Crops like corn are widely grown for a reason. They're extremely productive. They produce a hell of a lot of calories. There's a good study from a collaborator in Wisconsin who showed that when we just look at calories, monoculture corn produces more than a more diversified rotation. But if we look at the proportion of those calories actually making it into our food system, it's much, much lower, because so much of those calories are diverted for livestock or for biofuels. So this choice of metric is really a normative decision about what our food system kind of should look like and how should it be measured. I really like this work coming out of kind of a high-level report on taking a global perspective and thinking about what are the metrics that we're actually even using to evaluate our agriculture and our food systems, and how are they stacked for or against kind of the dominant industrial system. So we're trying to think really carefully about what metrics we choose and what assumptions are underlying those. Just to give you one example of how this can play out, we can share some preliminary results for just one site, the University of Guelph. This is when we're looking at gross returns across different types of rotations. we have a continuous corn, and then in this kind of gold color, and then more diversified rotations. So this is in kind of an odd unit called yield dollars, but this is when we would just basically multiply yields by whatever the crop price was for that particular crop in that particular year. Now, this figure is really similar now to what I was showing earlier with a measure of stress on the x-axis and yields on the y-axis, except that now we're looking at yield dollars. So we see a little bit different story now. Now we see that these more diversified rotations, again, we're looking at the whole rotation level now. Well, these more diversified rotations have a more stable gross returns. They don't have as much of a slope, but there's some opportunity costs as this environmental index goes up. So I wouldn't take this, this is very much in progress work, but just to kind of give you an example of what we're thinking about and how we're trying to move to a broader perspective. Okay, and then the last question that remained kind of unanswered is okay, we see these effects from more diversified rotations that are supporting higher yields in stressful environments, but what's behind them? That's not something we can really answer clearly with the types of syntheses that we've been doing. But some other studies have started to look at this. There's hypotheses around, well, it's changes in maybe available water. More water is available, better soil quality, it's holding more water, or there's more nutrient availability, or maybe reductions in pests and diseases and more diversified rotations. And these are not mutually exclusive explanations. In fact, they could all be operating simultaneously or under different conditions. But this relationship and the direct effects of soil organic matter on water availability have been getting a lot of attention. But the actual evidence of this playing out is a little bit mixed. So first, this is a graph from the first paper that I showed on soil organic matter and crop yields at the county level. We did a path analysis looking at a measure of this is available water capacity, soil organic matter and yields, as well as cation exchange capacity as sort of a rough measure of fertility, and show that soil organic matter available water capacity does predict yields, but there's this huge path of soil organic matter that goes straight to yields that doesn't go through water, and it doesn't go through this measure of fertility. Another study that I was involved with a grad student from UC Davis that's done one of the only manipulative field experiments on water stress across different types of rotation, also showed that there was this direct relationship between soil organic matter and plant water status that led to higher yields, but that wasn't mediated by soil physical properties, wasn't mediated by changes in available water capacity. So there's something else maybe going on. This was another question that we aren't exactly answering, but maybe hinting at. So in kind of parallel to our work on yield syntheses, we did field sampling from 5 of the long-term experiments that were involved in that project. This was led by a former postdoc, Maria Moshammer, in my group, where we looked at soil microbial community composition and soil and the actual chemistry, what compounds are in soil organic matter across different rotations. And what we see is that these different rotations have very distinct microbial communities and somewhat distinct signatures of different SOM chemistry, different soil organic matter chemistry. In particular, in the more diversified rotations, we see an increase in the relative and absolute abundance of a key group of soil microbes called arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So this doesn't provide any definitive evidence about a mechanism, but it does at least point us to the fact that we also need to be thinking about soil biology in these systems and the role that soil biology can play in helping crops deal with water stress. But regardless of the mechanisms are important scientifically, they're super interesting, but we may not actually need to know much about the mechanisms if we are interested in valuing the risk reduction from cropping system diversification, right? Epidemiologists can point to a link between smoking and lung function and health, and we can understand that there's a negative relationship there, but we don't necessarily need to know the physiological processes by which that actually occurs, right? So the question that we kind of came to after doing a lot of this synthesis work is, okay, well, we're showing some value. We're showing that these systems are reducing risk. Could that value be captured and unlocked and passed back to farmers? And could this in turn help support a transition away from these highly simplified monoculture or two-crop systems and bring along all these other benefits from diversified agriculture, right? This is a paper from folks at the University of New Hampshire that really spell out some of this kind of vicious lock-in cycle that helps kind of keep these industrialized systems in place. Part of this is federal policy that reflects the externalities of these systems. So could we intervene somehow and take this information that we've learned about risk reduction and apply it, for instance, to crop insurance or other industries that value risk? So that leads me to kind of the last part of our work that I wanted to share with you today. And the first question, because we need to move now from long-term experiments, which insurers don't care about, it's too site specific. We need information from a much bigger area, from actual working farms. And so the first step to do that is actually to understand, well, how much of the Corn Belt is in diversified rotation? Where are they at the field level? And what's driving those patterns? And so this was really awesome work that a PhD candidate, Yvonne, did a couple of years ago, where we actually mapped crop rotational diversity across this area. We used available data from the USDA's cropland data layer to create a temporal stack of cash crops that were being grown, and then applied a metric to assess the turnover of species from year to year, right? This was tricky because we didn't know the true rotation on any given field. We could only look at what farmers were doing, what we were seeing from these satellite images, and we had to be able to create a metric that captured that. So this series of images shows corn, wheat rotation, right? That's field 1, and a different rotation here in field 2. And based on this other new metric that we're using of crop rotational complexity, these are the numbers that it would be assigned. So this was the resulting map. Here, the yellow colors are what we think of as a true corn monoculture. This is over a 6-year period where corn was planted year after year. The kind of intermediate green color is a corn soybean rotation. This is about 55% of the study area. And then about 25% of the study area is more complex than a corn soy rotation. So then we were able to ask, okay, well, what's driving these patterns that we're seeing? We see some, you look back, you see some real patterns here, right? Darker colors kind of along some of the margins, some of the, we have this heart of the Corn Belt there in Iowa, and then darker colors kind of around the margins. What's behind those patterns? And 3 key factors came out. One is that as land quality increases, this metric here is a metric of land capability or land quality. As land quality increases, we actually tend to see lower crop rotational diversity, right? This is based on inherent soil and topographical characteristics. And so one interpretation of this is that farmers who have less quality land actually have to rotate more in order to be productive. And that farmers with very high quality land can effectively mine the soil and get away with monocropping. We also see that as the variance of rainfall increases, we see more rotation. And another interesting factor was that closer proximity to biofuel facilities also tends to predict lower rotational diversity. So it influences not only land, but also policy. Okay, now that we have RCI mapped, would it be possible to actually quantify the so-called resilience effect on actual fields at a wide regional scale? So also comes with challenges. How do we actually obtain data on yield at the field scale? How do we deal with the statistical challenges and the data challenges of an observational data set across this enormous area? Well, this was kind of catalyzed by a research project that's come together with an NGO partner called LandCorp. So I gave a talk at the 2019 Soil Society meeting on some of our early work on crop rotation syntheses, and then was connected with Aria McLaughlin from LandCorp, an NGO that works on federal soil health policy. And she was excited to create a project that really aimed at providing information at a scale and a resolution that would be relevant to actually shaping policy. So we formed a so-called risk model working group that brought together a cross-sector team, researchers, government agency folks, some private sector folks. And in 2021, LandCorp formed a partnership with a farm credit cooperative. So in the US, farm credit cooperatives are who are giving loans to farmers for mortgages, for their operating expenses. And in addition to crop insurers, care about risk. This was actually a key insight that folks at LandCorp had, was that the lending, agricultural lending in the US is $300 to $400 billion annually. And all of these lenders care about risk. So, but none of them take into account the actual practices and the actual risk of the farming practices that farmers are using. They're looking at things like personal credit scores. So if we could provide information that allowed for quantifying risk, then if even a small portion of that enormous amount of lending could be somewhat redirected towards farmers who are taking efforts to reduce their risk, that would be an enormous shift towards supporting these farmers in these types of systems. So our project had these three goals around allowing institutions to price risk, to quantify the value of diversified cropping systems, to help farmers capture that value of diversifying crop rotations and adopting cover crops, and then really with the goal of increasing the adoption of these practices. As you saw, diversified rotations are a small proportion of the landscape. And when we think about something like cover crops, it's even much, much smaller. About 5% of the land area is in cover crops. So this took more partnerships. We connected with David Lobel at Stanford to obtain field scale maps of crop yields through about a 20-year period. These are modeled, combination of remote sensing and modeled yields, but are the only way that we can access yield estimates at the field scale. And then brought together new partnerships for on the statistical side of things, and also on new dimensions like agriculture economics, and with Lawson Connor at the University of Arkansas, new expertise with geospatial data manipulation with a new staff member, Kangogo Sugomo, as well as our statistical collaborators at Michigan State University. And so we're kind of in the early stages of this project, but like I said, we're excited to have just gotten some new funding and are expanding what we're able to do with folks now. Perry is going to be involved, and Yang-Hui Kang and Mayo Bussini, others here at Berkeley. But what we've been doing so far is developing models that predict corn yield from the rotational complexity index that Yvonne put together, are the measure of vapor pressure deficit, which I mentioned earlier is a good measure of water stress, measures of land capability, and then looking at an interaction between rotational complexity and vapor pressure deficit to ask, under conditions of water stress, do more diverse crop rotations, does corn grown in more diverse crop rotations across this regional scale be less affected by stressful conditions? So I'm not going to go into the details of the statistical modeling, but just provide a couple of first start with a couple of pieces of results here. First, starting with just predictions from a single field. This was also work that Ben Goldstein, PhD student in ESPM, contributed substantially to. So this is just predictions from one field from this kind of regional model, where we have RCI, that's our rotational complexity, that's low versus high. We have drought weather conditions that are either dry or normal. And we're looking at downside and upside probabilities. If you recall earlier, downside probabilities are the probabilities of yields falling below a certain threshold. Upside probabilities, so potential for yield for low yields, or high yield, or potential for upside probability, potential for high yields. Now, what our model can show at the field scale is the extent to which RCI in dry conditions or normal conditions affects downside or upside probabilities. So for instance, in this field, we see a 6.5% decrease in the chance of reduced yields with higher rotational complexity. 7.2% increase in chance of increased yields with increased rotational complexity. We see much less of an effect during normal growing conditions here. All right, so that's an example of a prediction from one field, and now we can start to look at more of a multi-state scale. So now imagine that we have these predictions for every single field growing corn in each of these counties. Now what these colors are showing is the proportion of fields in that county where we see improvements in upside potential or reducing downside risk. So the blue colors are where we see nearly all of the fields showing reductions in risk or improvements in upside potential with diversified rotations, whereas in the red colors, that's where we actually see a low proportion of fields. So we see some decreasing risk or increasing upside probability. So we see some spatial patterning here that we're trying to understand a little bit better. But this is just kind of one preview of where we're at in developing these regional types of models. All right, so just to circle back a bit, all of this has been kind of in service of thinking about how do we align policies to encourage diversification and all of its co-benefits, right? We see from Yvonne's work that we have these biophysical factors like more marginal soils or climate variabilities that might be pushing farmers towards diversification. But we have these policies like crop insurance or a biofuel mandate that are pushing farmers in the opposite direction. Can we use this information to have smarter crop insurance policies, to align, to take funds from agricultural lenders to reward risk mitigation through diversification, and actually have a more coherent set of forces that are encouraging diversification? All right, so just some takeaways that I'd love to leave you with. Diversifying rotation does often reduce the risk of negative impacts of droughts, while also increasing upside potential. Farmers are using these diversified rotations in more marginal lands, but policies are incentivizing simplification. We try to pass the value of risk reduction back to farmers. This will continue to require translational research to actually provide the information needed, but it's also going to take a lot of political will. Right? These are very entrenched systems. But if we can do that, and more diversified cropping systems can result, there'll be a lot of co-benefits. In terms of reductions in non-renewable inputs, potential for increases in soil carbon, and other environmental and social benefits. So that's what I have for you today. So thanks for all of your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
I was wondering if you would get the same sort of benefit of computation during drought years. So if farmers knew like the only yield was coming, if they plant the residue crops then and plant the crops they want during years like the yields.
Yeah, really good question. You think that because the likely mechanism here involves some sort of feedback to soil, right? Like you think of the soil as kind of the memory of crop rotation. These changes in soil are probably slow, and they probably take a fairly long time to accumulate. So you would need probably somewhat of a history of rotational diversity that led to some improvements in soil to actually then see the benefits. So it's not as much of a, now you might see other benefits of planting different things on your farm if you knew something was coming. More about the portfolio effect than about this kind of feedback to soil these changes in soil that could feedback to crop production. So,
Why don't you talk a little about adult fertilizer application and how that fits into the picture? I'm just kind of curious, with crop rotation or not, how fertilizer application rates may vary and affect sort of the yield trajectory that you described.
No, that's an excellent question. In the synthesis that the long-term experimental synthesis that we did, we had a number of different treatments where that varied in fertilizer inputs from no fertilizer inputs to relatively high inputs. And so we actually looked to see if the effect of diversified rotations say disappeared with very high levels of nitrogen, like if it was redundant. We saw that the effects of rotational diversity diminished with higher levels of fertilizer inputs, but were still quite present. So they were most apparent with no inputs. In our kind of regional modeling, I would love to have a data set on fertilizer inputs to actually be able to build that into the model, because I think it's going to be a big driver. We know that one of the benefits that farmers often see from diversified rotations is less of a need for fertilizer inputs. And clearly it's a big driver of yields. But unfortunately, as far as I know, that at the field level, that doesn't exist. Let's see, I'll go Dennis and kind of wrap around.
Nice thought. So given that a farm has to pay maybe $100,000 for a harvester.
Yeah.
Do you think the reality is that they're willing to take the risk and be able to corn more often to get more profit to pay for that and to have to diversify? And will it be a tipping point, or does there need to be a tipping point for them to actually adopt a more diverse practice?
Totally. I mean, this is this phenomenon of path dependency, right? And it's a well-known lock-in that farmers experience around. They have a lot of capital outlays for these big pieces of equipment. So I think that's a role. That's potentially a role for public support to help farmers break out of that type of a lock-in. We bear the costs regardless. We bear the costs in eutrophication and flood damage, right? So, but yeah, I think it's a real issue. Yeah.
So subsidize this versus subsidize that.
Yeah. Let's see, we have Keith and then Michael.
Yeah, I have some thoughts on your comments about structure of the farm bill and the insurance bill. But it's
Yeah.
long enough, I'll send you an email.
Okay, I love that.
I think it is, but one of the things I hated, but also enjoyed over the years was advocating for parts of the farm bill by visiting congressional offices.
Great, I would love to hear your take on that, yeah.
In this case, I was wondering if you've ever tried to segment and look at a true extreme event. Take on this, thinking of the work of people like Wolfram Schlinker about tipping points specifically for corn and soybean yields
Yeah,
that are purely temperature, not necessarily precipitation driven.
we, in the newly funded work, one of the things that we'll be doing is looking at specific events. I mean, this teasing out temperature versus precipitation, or temperature versus moisture, let's say.
Because you're cooling them and measure you're using,
Yeah.
it's workforce and fire. but-
Yeah, and there's good work, there's good work from Kanye Blunt's group at the University of Illinois, showing that's done a lot of decomposition of temperature and moisture. And showing that vapor pressure deficit really is the best predictor of water stress. At least for these plants. And then, of course, these things often co-occur, right? So,
But in
Yeah.
cognitive function, once we
Yeah.
study,
yeah,
there aren't the continuous functions we're always trying to.
Yeah.
It seems like we need to verify or demonstrate that there's no such factor. I'm always worried that Wolfram's work didn't have an underlying physiological mechanism to explain it.
right. Yeah, I think Dennis would be the expert in the room on this probably, but I think this work from Kanye Blunt's group is really much more physiologically grounded. In linking vapor pressure deficit, yeah.
Well, we have a question, but I want you to think with me for a second. I understand your vision of trends, right? You've got rise of monoculture under conditions, with very phenomenons, with increasing insurance, it would make sense, right?
Yeah.
But I would not argue that is different from the internal population of capital.
Yeah,
It actually is not consistent. So, for example, another example, flood insurance, right? Over climate change conditions hasn't prevented people from moving in these various conditions. It's actually encouraged people to move in right. So you can also think about the ways, the insane way side of urbanization, for example, where we're not building after the buildings or cities for people to live in, but we're building buildings and cities for people to invest in, for bondholders to actually invest. So what you're arguing for, I would say, is consistent with the internal contradictions of neoliberal capitalism and risk society more generally, right? So another way to think about this is that we're organizing farms under these risk conditions, and farmers, organizing farm and land is not for farmers, right, but for bond markets, for financialization of these environments. And so loans to farmers here are putting farmers more in debt, which is consistent with the debt economy, which is integral to neoliberal capitalism.
Right.
So I just want you to think with me here for a second that this is actually not a contradiction, but is actually consistent with the ways in which the economy goes through debt, and what that might mean for farms in the future, what that might mean for diversification on those farms. I mean, I just, today I was reading something on Wall Street hedge funds buying land in California, not for the land itself, but for the water that flows through that
absolutely,
land,
yeah.
right? So if we were to change your kind of entry point into risk society in the contradiction, but also rather than consistent, how might that change the type of work you might think about doing in terms of diversification of farms?
No, it's an excellent point, Michael. And when I say it doesn't make sense, it's not because I'm saying it's something about the system is not making sense. I agree completely. The system is set up to function exactly the way that it is. I think when I say it doesn't make sense, it's more like it's not the way it's set up is not going to help us decrease risk. Actually, it actually increases risk. And your comment about I think the role of lending and lending kind of increasing the debt burden of farmers. And I also agree with that. And so this is not, I'm not definitely careful to say this is not like, we think about the transitions literature, right? And right, this is still operating in the regime. This is not transformative. But I think it can move the needle. And so that's at least why I stayed engaged with it, even if I have some internal, I have these types of questions for myself. But I appreciate your premise of what if we started from a different starting point and how would that affect? And so I think that would be that was a great thought experiment. Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
And with the corn soybean rotations that went in 30 years ago, there was also a trend to, they're not all the same. One is, some operate on no-till or just no-till.
Right.
Some use conventional tillage. And the no-till has had significant reductions in erosion.
Yes.
Do you look at differences within that general category?
Yeah, great question. We do have a remotely sensed tillage or a tillage data set that we will be looking at in our last project that I mentioned. At this point, the adoption of no-till is very high in these systems. I think tillage in these systems is really tricky. On the one hand, from a soil erosion standpoint, it's very positive. It's had massive reductions in soil erosion. On the other hand, it's entirely herbicide dependent. And the amount of glyphosate use has skyrocketed since these systems went into place. Leading to all the negative things we talk about. So let's say yes, I think the role of tillage is important and potentially in moderating the rotational diversity effect, and we have a data set to look at it. But I think we see more potential for co-benefits from these diversification strategies than we do from no-till. Yeah, good question. Thanks, everybody.
And we're at time, so